A ship sinks off the southern coast of Turkey, weighed down with 10 tons of copper, glass ingots in blue and lavender, ostrich eggshells, and jewelry from at least 7 different civilizations. It never reaches its harbour, and within 100 years of that wreck settling into the sand, every great power that might have claimed its cargo, Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenae, the palaces of Ugarit, will be burning, broken, or gone. Nobody at the time sees it coming. That's the part worth sitting with. This is the story of the late Bronze Age collapse. A moment, somewhere around 1177 BC, when the first truly connected world quietly fell apart. We'll move from the Uluburun shipwreck to the trading networks that made these kingdoms rich, through earthquakes, famine, and the mysterious raiders history remembers as the Sea Peoples, all the way to the long, quiet centuries that followed. Much of what we're drawing on tonight comes from Eric Klein's book on the subject, 1177 BC, which pieces together this puzzle from clay tablets, shipwrecks, and the last desperate letters of kings. So there's no need to hold on to any of it tonight. Dim the light if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop. There's nothing sharp in this video. No sudden music, no jump cuts, nothing built to startle you awake. If sleep finds you in the next few minutes, that's exactly what this was made for. The chapter list is in the description, so tomorrow night you can pick up wherever you left off. For now, let's drift back to a time when the world felt, for a little while, whole, and go find that ship. Chapter 1: The First Global Age. The night sky over the eastern Mediterranean 35 centuries ago arched above a world far more connected than most people imagine when they picture the ancient past. This was not an age of scattered, isolated kingdoms, each minding its own valley or coastline. It was, instead, the dawn of something startlingly familiar, a network of trade routes, marriages, letters, and gold that stretched from the Nile to Anatolia, from Crete to Babylon. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age. It might just as easily be called the First Global Age. The story begins in Egypt, in the years after the Hyksos were driven from the Nile Delta around 1550 BC. With that expulsion, a new dynasty rose, and with it, a hunger for the wider world. Consider the city of Peru Nefer, a delta port once known as Avaris. Around 1450 BC, Pharaoh Thutmose III ordered a grand palace built there, and the walls he commissioned were unlike anything Egypt had seen before. Aegean artists, trained in the workshops of Crete, arrived to paint them. They worked in true fresco, laying pigment into wet plaster so that the colour became part of the wall itself, a technique they had carried across the Great Green, as the Egyptians called the Mediterranean Sea. What they painted was stranger still. Men leaping over the horns and backs of charging bulls. A scene born of Minoan ritual, now blooming on Egyptian plaster. The same bull-leaping frescoes appeared at Cabri in the Levant, at Alalak in Anatolia,
at Katna in Syria, a shared visual language painted by travelling hands, understood across a dozen courts. Trade moved in the other direction too, and not only through artists. Queen Hatshepsut, ruling Egypt in her own right for over 2 decades, sent expeditions outward rather than armies. She dispatched ships to Canaan for timber, to the Sinai for copper and turquoise, and most famously, in her 9th regnal year, to the distant land of Punt. The walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari still preserve that journey in relief. Palm trees, exotic animals, ships rendered down to their rigging and masts, and the memorable image of Punt's queen, her figure carved with careful, almost startled detail. These were peaceful missions, built on exchange rather than conquest, and they set a tone that would echo for generations.
By the following century, that tone had become policy across an entire diplomatic world, and the clearest window into it opened by accident. In 1887, a peasant woman digging at Tel el Amarna, the site of Akhenaten's short-lived capital, uncovered a cache of clay tablets that had once filled the city's records office. Nearly 400 of them survive, written in Akkadian, the language that served as the era's diplomatic lingua franca, no matter which throne a king sat upon. These Amarna letters, now scattered among museums in Berlin, London, Paris, Cairo, Chicago, and Moscow, capture the daily texture of international life. Complaints, requests, congratulations, and endless negotiation between the palaces of Egypt, Babylonia, Mitanni, Hatti, and Cyprus. What stands out immediately in these letters is the language the kings used with one another. A ruler in Amurru wrote to his counterpart in Ugarit, insisting, "My brother, look, I and you, we are brothers, sons of a single man, we are brothers." Tushratta of Mitanni opened his letters to Amenhotep III the same way, wishing well not just for the pharaoh, but for his wives, his household, his horses, his chariots. This was not sentiment so much as strategy. Anthropologists note that societies without formal markets or shared kinship often invent family ties to make trade possible. And that is exactly what happened here. Calling a foreign king brother turned a stranger into kin, and kin could be trusted, or at least obligated. Not every court embraced the fiction easily. The Hittites, famously prickly about such claims, had one king demand, "Why should I write to you in terms of brotherhood? Are we sons of the same mother?" Egypt, by contrast, extended the title almost automatically, folding rival kings into an imagined brotherhood regardless of their age or standing. Sometimes the fiction became fact. Amenhotep III turned diplomatic marriage into an art form, taking into his harem the daughters of Kassite kings from Babylon, of Mitannian kings Shatana II and Tushratta, and of Tarkandaradu of Arzawa in Anatolia. Each marriage sealed a treaty. Each bride arrived trailing an inventory of wedding gifts recorded across dozens of tablet lines. chariots, horses, jewelry, attendants. When Kadashman Enlil of Babylon offered his daughter, with unusual bluntness, tying the marriage explicitly to a shipment of gold, Amenhotep III scolded him for it. "It is a fine thing that you give your daughters in order to acquire a nugget of gold from your neighbors." The marriage happened anyway. Once Tushratta's sister, and later his daughter, Tadu-Hepa, entered the Egyptian court, he could rightly call the pharaoh both brother and son-in-law, the metaphor of kinship made literal. And always, threading through these letters, ran the subject of gold. Egypt controlled the mines of Nubia, and its wealth in gold became legend among the other courts. Tushratta wrote to Amenhotep III that, "In my brother's country, gold is as plentiful as dirt." Assur-uballit I of Assyria used almost the same phrase. "Gold in your country is dirt. One simply gathers it up." The requests came again and again, dressed in flattery, but unmistakably urgent. Yet gold promised was not always gold delivered. Kadashman Enlil complained to Amenhotep III that a gift of 30 minas, once examined, looked like silver. His successor, Burnaburiash II, went further, describing how 40 minas sent to him yielded barely 10 once melted in the kiln, and how a later shipment of 20 minas produced not even 5, the residue looking, in his words, like ashes. Whether Egyptian officials skimmed the shipments or merchants swapped the metal along the road remains unknown. But the frustration was real, preserved in clay for anyone to read 3,000 years later. By the 14th century BC, this web of letters, marriages, and gold had a name worth giving it: a great powers club. Egypt, the Hittites, Mitanni, and Kassite Babylon sat at its center, soon joined by an ambitious Assyria, whose king insisted he deserved equal rank with Mitanni's. Cyprus and the Mycenaeans hovered at its edges. A Hittite treaty of the following century would list, quite plainly, the kings who counted as equals: Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, and for a time, Ahiawa. It reads almost like a modern summit roster. The world was already, unmistakably, becoming one world, connected by clay tablets, gold caravans, painted plaster, and the careful, constant fiction of brotherhood between thrones. Chapter 2: A Ship of Treasures. The story of that connected world could easily have remained a matter of clay tablets and painted plaster, of words exchanged between palaces. But in 1982, the sea gave back something more immediate: a ship. It happened off the southwestern coast of Turkey, near a rocky headland whose name translates roughly as Grand Promontory, Uluburun. A young Turkish sponge diver, working the coastal waters as generations of divers had before him, came up from one of his very first dives with an odd description for his captain. He had seen, he said, metal biscuits with ears scattered across the seabed far below. "It sounds like nothing at all," said that way. "A strange little riddle." But the captain understood exactly what it meant. He had been shown photographs not long before by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M University, led by the archaeologist George Bass, and told to keep watch for objects of a particular shape. What the diver had found, lying in the dark at the base of the promontory, were Bronze Age copper ingots, cast in a form unmistakable once you have seen it. Flat, rectangular, with 4 projecting corners. Legs, almost, or ears, giving the whole thing the silhouette of an animal hide stretched out to dry. The wreck lay deep. Its stern rested some 140 feet below the surface, and the rest of the hull sloped down further still to 170 feet. At that depth, divers cannot simply stay and work. The increased pressure of the gases they breathe brings on a kind of narcotic fog, a slow-motion drunkenness. Bass himself described it as feeling as though they had had 2 martinis before starting. Because of this, the INA teams limited themselves to 2 20-minute dives a day, resurfacing, waiting, descending again. It was slow, exacting, dangerous work. And yet over the following decade, from 1984 to 1994, the divers logged more than 22,000 descents to that one patch of seabed, piecing together, inch by inch, the outline of a ship that had gone down some 3,000 years before. What they found, as the silt was cleared away, was not merely a wreck. It was a cross-section of an entire world in miniature. A single cargo hold containing goods from at least 7 different countries, states, and empires, all bound together on one Canaanite-built vessel, sailing sometime around 1300 BC. The bulk of the cargo was copper, some 10 tons of it, likely mined and smelted on the island of Cyprus, and cast into more than 350 of those distinctive oxhide ingots, so called because each one does resemble the flayed hide of a slaughtered ox, corners curling upward like the stiffened edges of a stretched skin. The divers found them stacked in careful herringbone rows, 4 deep, exactly as the ship's crew had loaded them millennia before. 3,000 years underwater had not been kind to the metal. Many ingots had corroded and cracked until they were dangerously fragile, threatening to crumble at a touch. Bass's conservators solved this with a peculiar trick of patience. They injected a special adhesive directly into the decayed copper, then left it alone for a full year, while the glue slowly hardened in place underwater, binding the ingot's ghost back into something solid enough to lift. Beside the copper sat roughly a ton of tin, the other half of the recipe for bronze. Tin sources were rare in this world, and the likeliest origin for this particular ton was Badakhshan, in what is now Afghanistan, a place that lay not across any sea, but thousands of miles inland, over mountains and plains, long before it ever reached a harbour and a waiting hull. Copper by ship, tin by caravan, 2 raw materials converging from opposite ends of the known world, to be melted together into weapons and tools. There was also glass, nearly 200 ingots of it, raw and unworked, most a deep cobalt blue.
though some ran to lighter blue, to purple, to a warm honeyed amber. These had travelled from Mesopotamia, destined for some workshop where craftsmen would melt and shape them into beads and inlay and jewellery, and packed among some 140 Canaanite storage jars. Jars that also held grapes, pomegranates, figs, coriander, sumac, was a ton of terebinth resin, tapped from pistachio trees. The same fragrant resin used in the perfume workshops at Pylos on the Greek mainland. A ship, in other words, carrying not only metal for weapons, but the raw material of scent.
Among all of this bulk cargo, one object stood out for its smallness and its strangeness. A scarab of solid gold. Rare enough on its own, but this scarab bore hieroglyphs spelling out a name. Neferu Arten, a form of the name belonging to Nefertiti, wife of Akhenaten, and one she used only in the first 5 years of her reign. That detail alone gave archaeologists a flaw beneath which the ship's sinking could not have occurred. It could not have sailed before Akhenaten and Nefertiti came to the throne, around 1350 BC. Combined with radiocarbon dates from the ship's timbers, and with the styles of Mycenaean and Minoan pottery found aboard, 4 independent lines of evidence converged on the same narrow window. Somewhere around 1300 BC, give or take a few years. The people aboard left their own quiet traces. Swords and daggers of both Italian and Mycenaean type were recovered. One sword fitted with an inlaid hilt of ebony and ivory, suggesting that whatever flag this Canaanite-built ship sailed under, at least 2 of the men aboard, and probably more, had come from the Aegean world. An international cargo carried by an international crew. And finally, almost overlooked amid the copper and glass and resin, the fragments of a small wooden tablet, hinged with ivory, found tucked inside one of the storage jars, as if it had floated there while the ship went down. Its wax writing surface, the very thing meant to carry words, had dissolved away long before divers ever reached it, leaving the tablet blank, its secrets gone. It may once have held the ship's manifest, some careful accounting of everything now scattered across the seabed. It is hard not to think, gazing at that hollow wooden frame, of Homer's phrase for such an object: a tablet with baneful signs. Carried across the sea, its message lost, its cargo eloquent enough to speak for itself. Chapter 3: Brothers and Rivals. The Uluburun ship had gone down sometime around 1300 BC, its cargo still telling its silent story of connection and exchange. But the world that built it was not only a world of merchants, it was also, increasingly, a world of kings watching each other across borders, measuring strength and preparing for war. By the 13th century BC, the diplomacy of the Amarna age had hardened into something more brittle. The letters that once opened with "my brother" now carried an edge. Somewhere beneath the courtesy, everyone was counting chariots. The Hittites, who had spent generations rebuilding their strength after a period of weak kings, had by now become one of the great powers of the ancient world, rivaling Egypt and outpacing Mitanni, Assyria, Babylonia, and Cyprus. Their reach extended through Anatolia and deep into northern Syria, precisely the region Egypt considered its own frontier. Two ambitious rulers, the Hittite king Muwatalli II and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, were on a collision course. And in 1274 BC, that collision came at a city called Kadesh. The battle is known to us almost entirely through Egyptian eyes. Carved in stone at 5 different temples, from the Ramesseum to Abu Simbel, in both a short official bulletin and a longer, more theatrical poem. No Hittite account survives to argue back. What the Egyptian version describes is a battle nearly lost before it began. The Hittites, it seems, understood something about war that went beyond chariots and bronze, the value of a well-placed lie. 2 Shoshu Bedouin were sent toward the Egyptian line, apparently by design, and were duly captured. Under questioning, they told Ramesses exactly what the Hittites wanted him to hear, that Muwatalli's army was still far to the north, near Amaru, nowhere close to Kadesh. Ramesses believed them. He did not wait to confirm it. He rode ahead with his leading division, the division of Amun, eager to seize the city before the enemy could arrive. But the enemy had already arrived. The entire Hittite force, thousands of chariots, tens of thousands of men, was crouched in the shadow of Kadesh's walls, hidden from the approaching Egyptians by the city itself. By the time 2 more captured spies revealed the truth under interrogation, it was already too late. The trap closed. Ramesses, by his own later account, found himself surrounded, alone by himself and none other with him, ringed by 2,500 enemy chariots. What follows in the temple inscriptions is less a battle report than a hymn. Ramesses calls out to his father Amun, and the god answers, taking his hand. The king describes shooting to his right and to his left, watching his enemies flounder before his own horse, like crocodiles plunging into the river, sprawling and falling upon one another, unable to find the will to fight. It is, almost certainly, a considerable exaggeration. No army of one, however favoured by the gods, holds back 37,000 infantry and 3,500 chariots alone. What the numbers do confirm is the sheer scale of the danger. Ramesses and his surviving divisions held their ground until reinforcements arrived and the Hittite lines broke. Kadesh ended not in triumph for either side, but in a bloody stalemate, each king able to claim victory only in his own temples. 15 years passed. Muwatalli died, and a new Hittite king, Hattusili III, came to the throne. In November or December of 1259 BC, the 2 empires did something the ancient world had rarely managed before. They wrote down peace and kept it. The Silver Treaty, as it came to be called, survives as one of the best preserved diplomatic documents from antiquity. The Hittite version, engraved in Akkadian on the tablet of solid silver, travelled to Egypt, where it was translated and carved permanently onto the walls of the Ramesseum and the Temple of Amun at Karnak. The Egyptian version made the reverse journey to Hattusa. Royal envoys carried the tablets between the two courts with all the ceremony of a state wedding, which, in a sense, is exactly what came next. 13 years after the treaty, Hattusili's eldest daughter travelled to Egypt to become the wife of Ramesses II. Ahead of her went a procession almost too large to imagine. Gold, silver, and copper in abundance. Slaves, horses beyond counting, cattle and sheep by the 10,000. A messenger announced her arrival to Pharaoh with evident awe. The daughter of the great ruler of Hatti, accompanied by all the grandees of the land. Two empires that had once tried to destroy each other at Kadesh were now, at least on paper and in blood, brothers. Yet peace with Egypt did not mean quiet everywhere. In western Anatolia, the Hittites faced a subtler, more persistent irritation. Not an army, but a single troublesome man named Pia Maradu. A renegade Hittite subject, he spent years destabilizing the region around Miletus, defeating Hittite vassal kings and stirring rebellion, very likely with the quiet backing of the Ahiawa across the sea. The Tawa Galawa letter, sent by a Hittite king, probably Hattusili III, to his royal brother in Ahiawa, complains bitterly of Pia Maradu's raids and his eventual escape by ship into Ahiawan territory. The letter even names Tawa Galawa, the Ahiawan king's own brother, as someone stirring up trouble in the region himself. Buried within the same letter is a fragment of older history, a quarrel over a place called Walusa, since resolved, the Hittite king writes, so that hostility between the two brothers need no longer continue. That name, Walusa, appears again in a treaty Muwatalli II once swore with a local king called Alexandu, promising to protect his descendants for generations against any enemy who might rise against them. Scholars have long noticed the echo in those names. Alexandu of Walusa, Alexander of Ilios, and in the region itself, long identified with Troy. Whether history and legend touch at that point, or only pass close by, the documents leave dangling a question no clay tablet has yet answered. Chapter 4: The Shaking Earth. The night comes down slowly over the ruins of Mycenae, and the stones hold their silence the way they have for more than 3,000 years. But look closely, in the failing light, at the great walls that still stand along the ridge north of the citadel. They do not run true. They lean subtly, as though some enormous hand had once pressed against them and then let go. This is not the wear of centuries. It is something else. The fingerprint of a moment. Sometime after 1225 BC and continuing perhaps for 50 years, the earth itself seems to have turned against the world so carefully built by kings and traders and scribes. Geologists who study the deep history of seismic faults call this kind of event an earthquake storm. Not a single violent afternoon, but a slow unzipping of pressure along a fault line, releasing its tension in pulses across years, even decades. One tremor loosens the ground. Years pass. Another follows, and another, until the fault has spent itself entirely. Across the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, in exactly the window when so many late Bronze Age cities were faltering, the ground did not stay still. The man who first gave voice to this idea was not a geologist, but an excavator, working in the dust of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. Claude Schaefer, who had spent years uncovering that city's palaces and temples, found something troubling in his own trenches. Long stone walls, knocked visibly off their alignment, tilted in ways no deliberate builder would have chosen. He became convinced that an earthquake had brought the city down. Later research would refine his claim. The quake he found seems to date closer to 1250 BC, and rather than ending Ugarit outright, it merely wounded the city, which was patched and rebuilt in the decades that followed, before some later disaster finished what the earthquake had begun. But Schaefer's instinct, that the earth itself might be a historical actor, opened a door that archaeologists are still walking through. What does an earthquake leave behind, thousands of years later, for someone to find? Not a signature, exactly, but a set of habits. Walls that collapse outward in only one direction, rather than the more expected damage of fire and looting. Columns that once stood upright, now lying on the ground in neat, parallel rows, like trees felled by a single gust of wind. Keystones slipped from the archways they once locked in place. At Mycenae, in the area once called the cult centre, walls were found still standing, but off-axis, shifted from true, as though the ground beneath them had simply moved. At Tiryns, some buildings show what excavators describe as undulating walls, rippled and warped in a way that fire alone could never produce. And then there are the bodies. At Mycenae, in the basement of a house some 200 meters north of the citadel, the skeletons of 3 adults and a child were found crushed beneath fallen stones, caught in a moment that gave them no warning. Elsewhere in the same city, in a doorway between a house's front room and its main room, the skeleton of a middle-aged woman was found with her skull crushed by a single falling block, as though she had been running for the threshold when the wall came down. At Tiryns, inside the Acropolis, the collapsed walls of a structure known as Building X held the remains of a woman and a child. 2 more skeletons were found near the fortification walls themselves, buried under debris that had fallen from above. At Medea, a young girl lay in a room near the east gate, her skull and backbone shattered by the stones that had once formed her shelter. Even in Jordan, at a site called Deir Allah, one victim was found beneath a fallen wall, a small, sorrowful echo of the same catastrophe, unfolding on a very different corner of the map. Reading these signs, though, is rarely simple. A city burned by war, and a city shaken by the ground look, at a glance, disturbingly alike. Both leave rubble. Both leave the dead. The difference lies in the details. Warfare tends to leave its weapons behind. At Aphek in Israel, arrowheads were found still lodged in the walls of buildings. At Troy, in the layer archaeologists call Troy 7A, bodies lay scattered in the streets, alongside more embedded arrowheads, the unmistakable grammar of an assault. At Lachish, by contrast, the dead were found without a single weapon nearby. A child fallen face down, an infant thrown to the ground, bodies positioned as though caught mid-flight from something that gave them no time to fight back. It looks, at first, like nature's hand rather than a soldier's, but the picture is never quite clean. The same site shows a temple that had been looted, muddying any tidy conclusion. What is clear is that these earthquakes, wherever they truly struck, rarely delivered a final verdict on their own. Mycenae, battered and scorched, its floors laced with mudwash from the collapse, was nonetheless reoccupied afterward, smaller and diminished but not abandoned. Tiryns endured a similar blow around 1200 BC and still rebuilt portions of its lower city, continuing on for decades more. Ugarit itself, once thought to have died in Schaefer's earthquake, shows clear signs of repair before its true end came later, by some other hand. The shaking, it seems, spread wide, from the Peloponnese to Anatolia, from Troy to the river valleys of Jordan, sparing, so far as anyone can tell, only Crete. It was not a single hammer blow. It was a long, uneven trembling beneath a world already straining under other pressures. And what those other pressures were is a story still waiting to surface. Chapter 5. The Empty Silos. Long before the word existed, the thing itself was already written into the ground and the stone. 50 years before anyone could prove it, a professor at Bryn Mawr College named Rhys Carpenter looked at the collapse of Mycenaean civilization and suggested, in a book that scholars mostly dismissed, that drought had done it. In 1982, a researcher named Barry Weiss, working far from any dig site at Bell Laboratories in Denver, Colorado, published a paper arguing much the same thing, 3 decades ahead of the evidence that would eventually vindicate him. For a long time these were guesses, elegant but unproven, the kind of theory that gets a polite footnote and nothing more. Then the ground began to talk. In Syria, near the ancient site of Tel Twaini, researchers named David Kaniewski and Elise Van Campo drilled down through layers of mud and pulled up something almost embarrassingly small to carry such weight. Pollen grains, thousands of years old, preserved in silt. Pollen does not lie about what grew where, and what it showed, layer after layer, was a landscape turning from forest and cropland into something drier, thornier, harder. A shift beginning in the late 13th or early 12th century BC and lasting for centuries. Across the water in Cyprus, at the Larnaca Salt Lake Complex, near the old port of Hala Sultan Tek, the same team found the same story. A green coastline turning brittle, groundwater failing, agriculture becoming, in their words, no longer sustainable. Israel told it too. A 20-meter core drilled from the bed of the Sea of Galilee, examined by Israel Finkelstein, Daphne Langut, and Thomas Litt, showed severe drought setting in around 1250 BC. Near Haifa Bay, Forest pollen gave way to scrubland, and then to open steppe, and the trees did not return for centuries. And the caves added their own testimony, drop by mineral drop. In Sorek Cave, in northern Israel, and later in a cave called Mavri Trippa on the island of Skidza, off the coast near Pylos, scientists read stalagmites the way others read tree rings. Each layer of stone a record of the water that once dripped to form it. The stalagmite at Mavri Trippa showed a sharp swing toward drier conditions beginning around 1200 BC, a trend that lasted more than 200 years. By 1000 BC, it had stopped growing altogether. No moisture reached it anymore. In Anatolia, lakes with names like Nar and Tesser and Eski Akigol yielded sediment cores telling an identical tale. An arid period beginning at the same moment and refusing to end. Scholars now call it the 3.2 KBP event. K for 1,000 years, BP for before present, and its scale is difficult to overstate. Martin Finney of Uppsala University would later call it simply the driest period the Eastern Mediterranean is known to have experienced. Kanievsky's team summarized it plainly: a nearly 300-year drought that caused crop failures, dearth, and famine, and that helped force whole populations to move. Whatever set it in motion, a distant volcano, a dimming sun, some shift in ocean currents no one alive could have named, the effect on the ground was the same. Fields that had fed cities for generations stopped yielding enough, and the people who depended on them began, in letter after surviving letter, to say so. The Hittite court said it first, and said it often. In the mid-13th century BC, Queen Puduhepa wrote to Ramesses II with a sentence stripped of all diplomatic softening: "I have no grain in my lands." A trade embassy was sent south soon after, seeking barley and wheat. Decades later, another Hittite writer, exasperated, asked whether the recipient of his letter had somehow failed to notice that there was a famine in the midst of Hittite lands. Egypt answered, at least for a while. Pharaoh Merneptah left an inscription recording that he had grain loaded onto ships and sent north to keep alive, in his own words, this land of Hatti. It is one of the strangest images to survive from the whole late Bronze Age. Egyptian grain barges crossing open water to save the population of a rival empire, because a rival empire fed was better than a rival empire collapsing into chaos on the border. But even Egyptian grain could not outrun the emergency forever. One Hittite king wrote directly to the king of Ugarit about a shipment: 2,000 units of grain, perhaps as much as 450 tons, and closed the letter with a line that needs no translation across 3,000 years. It is a matter of life or death. Ugarit's own archive, pulled from a house in the city belonging to a merchant named Ertanu, shows the crisis was never only about feeding distant allies. Inland at Emar, a man named Bania wrote to his contact in Ugarit with something close to a death notice for his own city. There is famine in your house. We will all die of hunger. If you do not quickly arrive here, we ourselves will die of hunger. You will not see a living soul from your land. Ugarit itself, that harbour once thick with foreign ships and foreign tongues, was not spared. Its own king wrote to Meneptah, begging him to save the land of Ugarit and give grain to save my life. Meneptah responded, gold, textiles, 7,000 dried fish, whatever could be spared. Later, Ugarit's last king, Amarapi, received a letter from Suppiluliuma II, ruler of a starving Hattusa, accusing him of failing to send food that Ugarit itself no longer had to give. One official inside the city put it as simply as language allows. Here with me, plenty has become famine. The silos, once the pride of a trading empire, stood empty. And into that emptiness, from every direction at once, something else was already moving. Chapter 6. The foreign countries made a conspiracy. Something else was already moving, and it moved the way weather moves, in fronts, across whole horizons at once. The Egyptians who watched it come had no single word for it. Later scholars would invent one: the Sea Peoples, a tidy, modern label stitched onto something the ancient world experienced as anything but tidy. The Egyptians themselves were more precise and stranger. They wrote down names: Peleset, Checker, Shekelesh, Shardana, Danuna, Weshesh. 6 names, at least, for 6 groups the Egyptians insisted were distinct from one another, moving together. Foreign-sounding names for foreign-looking people, as if the scribes wanted future readers to know this was no single horde, but a coalition, a confederation, an alliance of strangers who did not all speak the same tongue or worship the same gods, but had, for reasons the Egyptians could only guess at, arrived at the same terrible hour. They came in waves, over years, not in one clean line on a map. Some marched overland, sacking camps as they went and setting up in Amaru, on the Syrian coast, before turning south. Others came by ship, hugging the coastline of Canaan, past Megiddo, past Lachish, down toward the delta itself. And they did not travel light. Others drove them, plunder, or the hunger and displacement that had already been starving the Hittites and emptying the silos of Ugarit. They brought their households with them. Heavy ox carts loaded with possessions, women and children riding behind fighting men. This was not a raiding party looking to strike and vanish before dawn. This looked, to Egyptian eyes, like a people leaving somewhere and trying to arrive somewhere else. The record of what happened when they reached Egypt survives mostly on one set of walls: the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, near the Valley of the Kings. Rows of hieroglyphs run beside carved panoramas, some of them badly worn now by wind, water, and the passage of tourists. patiently copied and republished by Egyptologists from the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute across decades of the 20th century, precisely because time was erasing the originals even as scholars studied them. It is, in effect, the only eyewitness account, filtered, boastful, carved in stone by the winning side, of a catastrophe that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean. Ramesses III did not describe an invasion. He described a conspiracy. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands, the inscription reads. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. Kate, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, Alashia. Kingdoms and regions already known from the letters and treaties of the Great Powers Club are named as places that simply gave way, one after another, until the invaders camped in Amuru and turned their eyes toward the Nile. The temple walls do not describe a uniform enemy. They show a crowd. Some warriors wear tall, feathered headdresses rising above their brows. Others wear plain skull caps, or horned helmets, or nothing at all. Some have short, pointed beards and go bare-chested above a short kilt. Others are clean-shaven, wrapped in long garments that fall almost like skirts. They carry bronze swords, spears tipped in gleaming metal, bows, and behind the fighters, carved into the same stone, roll the ox carts, the detail that turns a battle scene into something closer to a census of displaced people. The battles themselves, land and sea, seem to have been fought nearly together in or near the delta. Perhaps a single sprawling engagement stretched across both water and shore. Perhaps ambushes sprung as the ships came in. Ramesses III leaves no doubt about the outcome he wanted remembered. Those who reached my frontier, their seed is not, he writes. Their heart and soul are finished forever and ever. He describes stockades of lances lining the riverbank, ships capsizing, enemies dragged from the water and killed in heaps, from tail to head. In the Papyrus Harris he goes further, naming names. The Danuna slain in their isles, the Checker and Peliset made ashes, the Shardana and Weshesh made as those that exist not. And yet, in the same breath, thousands taken captive, resettled in Egyptian strongholds, taxed in grain and cloth like any other subject population. Annihilation and absorption claimed in the same inscription. It was not Egypt's first brush with these names. 30 years earlier, in 1207 BC, in the 5th year of Pharaoh Merneptah, the same pharaoh remembered for the stele that carries the earliest known mention of Israel. A similar coalition had already tested Egypt's borders, this time riding alongside a Libyan chief. Inscriptions at Karnak list them: Ekwesh, Teresh, Luka, Shardana, Shekelesh, northerners coming from all lands. The victory count is chillingly precise, tallied in slain men and severed hands, a practice with roots reaching back to the Hyksos era at Avaris. 2 names, Shardana and Shekelesh, appear in both invasions, 30 years apart, suggesting survivors of the first wave returned or sent word home in the second.
Where any of them actually came from remains genuinely unsettled. Sicily and Sardinia attempting matches for Shekelesh and Shardana by sound alone, and Ramesses himself calls them peoples in their islands of the sea. Though some scholars suspect the causality runs backward, that these groups fled west to those islands only after Egypt broke them, rather than sailing east from them. The Peliset are the clearest case. Almost certainly the Philistines later settled along the Canaanite coast. And here, modern science has offered something the temple walls never could. A 2019 DNA study of infant burials beneath Philistine houses at Ashkelon found that close to half their ancestry traced to southern Europe, most likely Bronze Age Crete, the rest matching the local Canaanite population, evidence of newcomers who had, within a generation or two, thoroughly intermarried with the people already living there. Not a myth, not a boast on a temple wall, a silent inheritance, carried in bone, of a people who had crossed the sea and stayed. Chapter 7. The Last Tablet. The people of Ashkelon carried their answer in their bones, but 400 miles to the north, along the Syrian coast, another city had left its answer in clay. Thousands of tablets, baked hard by the very fire that destroyed the place that made them. That city was Ugarit, and its last king was a man named Amurapi. He had inherited a kingdom that still looked, on the surface, like the world described in the earlier chapters of this history. Ships arriving from Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean. Warehouses stacked with copper and cloth. Scribes drafting letters in the same diplomatic Akkadian that had crossed the Amarna court a century before. Ugarit had grown wealthy precisely because it sat at the hinge of that international system, a harbour where Hittite, Egyptian, and Cypriot interests all overlapped. That same wealth, in the end, made it a target no one could resist. Amurapi's surviving correspondence reads like a man watching a slow collapse from the inside. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma II wrote to him about a grain shipment running late, closing with a line of almost theatrical desperation. The sun himself is perishing. Amurapi, for his part, had his own emergencies. To the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish he wrote, not once, but 3 times, warning of an enemy massing near Rasu, just up the coast. His fleet, he explained, was away in Lucca. His infantry and chariotry was stationed inland, in Hittite territory. Ugarit itself sat undefended, its harbour open. "May my lord send me forces and chariots to save me," he wrote, "and may my lord save me from the forces of this enemy." No help came in time.
Or perhaps no help came at all. It is another of Amarapi's letters that has become the single most quoted line from the end of the Bronze Age, addressed not to Carchemish, but across the water to the king of Alashia on Cyprus, a ruler he called, with diplomatic humility, my father. The tablet, catalogued now as RS 20.238, was found in the palace archive at Ugarit, and it says, "My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. Doesn't my father know that all of my infantry and chariotry are stationed in Kat, and that all of my ships are stationed in the land of Luca? They have not arrived back yet, so the land is thus prostrate. Now the 7 ships of the enemy, which have been coming, have done harm to us. Now if other ships of the enemy turn up, send me a report somehow, so that I will know." For decades, this letter carried an especially haunting reputation. Claude Schaeffer, the archaeologist who first excavated Ugarit, believed it and dozens of companion tablets had been found sitting inside a kiln, placed there to be fired hard for the journey overseas, and never removed, because the city fell before the kiln could be emptied. The king's last plea, still cooling in the oven as the enemy broke through. It is a vivid image, and it found its way into textbook after textbook. But a more recent re-examination of the exact find spot has quietly overturned it. There was no kiln. The tablet had most likely been kept in a basket on the upper floor of a house. A basket that simply fell, along with the building around it, once the place was abandoned. The letter still speaks clearly enough for itself. It simply cannot be read anymore as a message frozen mid-departure, the very last words sent from a dying city. It is, instead, one voice among many, caught in the wreckage of ordinary life. Cyprus, meanwhile, sent its own warning back, and it was not reassuring. A senior official there named Eshiwara wrote to the king of Ugarit, denying responsibility for the raids along his coast, and in doing so, delivered an unsettling accusation. "As for the matter concerning those enemies," he wrote, "it was the people from your country and your own ships who did this, and it was the people from your country who committed these transgressions. I am writing to inform you and protect you. Be aware." 20 enemy ships, he added, had since vanished in an unknown direction. Whatever was happening along that coast, it was not simply a matter of foreign invaders arriving from nowhere. Some of the danger, it seems, had grown from within Ugarit's own maritime world. Sailors and crews turned predatory as the old order that had employed them came apart. The ground itself confirms how it ended. Excavation across the site has uncovered a destruction layer up to 2 meters thick in places, a compacted mass of collapsed walls, burnt plaster, and heaped ash. Residential quarters show ceilings and terraces fallen in, walls reduced to shapeless mounds of rubble. And scattered through it all, in the streets and inside the ruined houses, are arrowheads, the unmistakable residue of fighting that moved room by room, house by house. The people who lived there, some 8,000 of them, appear to have fled in haste. Buried hoards of gold and bronze, figurines, tools, weapons hidden for safekeeping, were left in the ground, never dug up again. Whoever buried them did not come back. One last letter, found among the ruins, needs no interpretation at all. Whoever wrote it had no time for diplomatic phrasing, no talk of brothers or fathers, only the plainest possible report. When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt, and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it. Somewhere between 1190 and 1185 BC, Ugarit burned, and it did not rise again. Unlike other cities of the region, which would be rebuilt on their own ruins generations later, Ugarit lay empty for roughly 6.5 centuries, its mound untouched until the Persian period. Its language, Ugaritic, one of the earliest alphabetic scripts ever devised, went silent with it. Its literature and mythology sealed inside the archives that killed the city in preserving them. Cuneiform writing itself would soon fade from this coast entirely. A city that had traded with half the known world, right up until the very end, simply stopped, and nothing was ever built on it again. Chapter 8. The Lights Go Out. The fires that took Ugarit were not the only ones burning that century. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in the span of perhaps 100 years, but concentrated most heavily in the decades around 1200 BC, city after city went dark. Not all at once, not from a single cause that historians can point to with confidence, but in a cascade, one centre after another losing its palace, its archive, its reason for existing as the world had known it. Consider Hattusa, the Hittite capital, a city of massive stone ramparts set high on the Anatolian plateau, hundreds of miles from any coast. When archaeologists finally dug through its destruction layers, they found exactly what a burned city should leave behind. Ash, charred wood, mud brick turned to slag by heat fierce enough to melt the bricks themselves. And yet something about the ruin did not add up. The palace was gone. Several temples were gone. A handful of gates had been destroyed. But the ordinary houses of the upper and lower city, where most of Hattusa's people actually lived, showed no burning at all. The picture that emerges is strange and quiet. The great storerooms of the palace had been emptied, not looted. Someone had taken the valuables away before the flames arrived. The royal family, it seems, had already gone, taking their possessions with them, leaving behind a capital that was more shell than city by the time the fire came. Who lit that fire remains uncertain, but the likeliest candidates were not raiders from the sea at all. The Kashka, the Hittites' old enemies from the mountains to the northeast, had been pressing on Hattusa for generations. A capital already abandoned, already hollowed out, would have made an easy target for a neighbour long kept at bay
by walls and treaties that had finally stopped meaning anything. Across the Aegean, on the Greek mainland, the palace at Pylos met a very different kind of end. Sudden, violent, and total. When Carl Blegen excavated its ruins in the mid-20th century, he described a fire of almost unbelievable intensity. Interior walls fused into shapeless lumps, stone burned down into lime, gold ornaments melted where they sat. The palace's timber framing, generous and heavy by design, had turned the building itself into fuel. Whatever set that fire, it did not merely burn Pylos, it cooked it.
That same heat, ironically, is the reason anyone can speak of Pylos at all today. In the palace archive room, clay tablets inscribed in Linear B, records that should have been dissolved in water and reused, as they were every year, were instead baked hard by the flames and sealed under collapsing rubble. The fire that ended the palace also froze its final year in place. Whether that end came from outside invaders or from rebellion within is not something the tablets can say. They record grain and bronze and rowers assigned to ships, not the name of whoever set the torch. Mycenae, the citadel that had given its name to an entire civilization, burned in its turn around 1190 BC. Fires broke out across the site, in the religious quarter known as the cult centre, in private houses, quite possibly in the palace itself. And archaeologists have found the terrace walls scorched hard enough to take on the texture of concrete, buried under nearly 2 meters of collapsed mud brick and carbonized beams. It looked, and was, catastrophic. But Mycenae did not vanish. People returned to live among the ruins on a much smaller scale, without the palace, without the administration that had once run the site as the seat of a kingdom. It was less a death than a long, slow diminishment, a citadel that kept a pulse after its heart had stopped. Farther south, in Canaan, the pattern repeats at Megiddo and Lachish, 2 of the great fortified cities of the Levant. At Megiddo, the palace of Stratum 7a burned in a fire severe enough that later builders simply leveled the debris and built on top of it rather than clear it away. At Lachish, a large public building known as the Pillared Building collapsed under fire and falling brick, and beneath the rubble, excavators found the skeletons of adults, children, and infants who never made it out. The excavator of Lachish called the destruction complete. The population, in his words, liquidated or driven out. Dating these ruins precisely depends, again and again, on small Egyptian objects caught in the ash. At Megiddo, an ivory pen case bearing the name of Pharaoh Ramesses III turned up, sealed inside the palace debris, meaning the destruction happened during or after his reign. At Lachish, a bronze plaque stamped with Ramesses III's cartouche was found buried beneath the same layer of collapse. A later object bearing the name of Ramesses VI has sometimes been used to push the date even further forward, though its find spot is less secure. and scholars are cautious about leaning on it too heavily. What both sites confirm, cautiously but clearly, is that this wave of destruction falls squarely within, or just after, the reign of Ramesses III, the same pharaoh who left his own account of a Sea People's invasion at Medinet Habu. Look closely at where the fires actually struck, and a pattern comes into focus. It is rarely the whole city that burns. At Megiddo, at Hattusa, at other sites across the region, ordinary houses often survive while the palaces, temples, and elite quarters are gutted. That is not incidental. The palace was where writing lived, where trade was organized, where taxes were collected, and grain was stored, and diplomatic letters were drafted to brothers on distant thrones. Destroy the palace, and there is no need to destroy the rest of the city. The system that held the kingdom together simply stops functioning. And still, at site after site, the question of who lit these fires resists an answer. There is no banner left standing over Pylos, no enemy inscription buried in the ash at Megiddo, no confession scratched into a wall at Lachish. Arrowheads turn up in the rubble here and there, evidence of violence, but not of its author. Invaders, rebels, raiders from the sea, neighbours long held at bay, all remain possibilities, and none come with proof. The lights went out across an entire interconnected world, and the world left behind no note explaining why. Chapter 9. A Perfect Storm. The great network of the late Bronze Age fell silent, and no inscription, no scribe, no survivor left behind an explanation for why. Perhaps that silence is itself the clue. Historians and archaeologists sifting through the ash layers at a dozen sites have gradually come to suspect that the question itself was framed wrong from the start. The search for a single culprit, earthquake, drought, invader, rebel, may be a search for something that never existed. What if no single cause was ever meant to be found, because no single cause was responsible? This is the idea that scholars have come to call systems collapse. The term belongs originally to the archaeologist Colin Renfrew, who in the late 1970s proposed that complex societies do not usually fall the way empires fall in storybooks, toppled by one dramatic blow. They fail as systems fail, gradually, then suddenly, as multiple supports give way at once. Joseph Tainter, who has spent a career studying how civilizations end, defines collapse simply as a sudden, pronounced loss of an established level of socio-political complexity. A society drops, in other words, to a simpler, smaller, less centralized version of itself. The palace stops issuing orders. The scribes stop keeping records. The elite who once commissioned frescoes and imported tin from 3,000 miles away disappear, and no one replaces them. Trade withers. Populations scatter to smaller, humbler settlements. All of this, Renfrew noted, can take decades to fully unfold, long enough that the people living through it might not have recognized day to day that they were witnessing the end of an age at all. The mechanism behind such a collapse is what researchers call the multiplier effect. No single disaster needs to be fatal if it strikes a healthy, well-supplied society. A city can survive an earthquake. A kingdom can survive a bad harvest. But when an earthquake strikes a kingdom already gutted by famine, the toppled granaries that might have fed the hungry are simply gone, and there is nothing left to fall back on. When invaders appear on a coastline where the harbour towns are already emptied by hunger, and the army is already spread thin trying to guard grain convoys, resistance collapses faster than it otherwise would. Each calamity does not simply add to the others, it multiplies them, stripping away whatever margin of safety a society had left. A drought that might have been survivable in an ordinary year becomes catastrophic when it coincides with a seismic disaster that has already reduced granaries and defensive walls to rubble. This is why the Hittite king begged for grain as a matter of life or death, and why the granaries of Ugarit, when they finally burned, took with them whatever chance the city had of recovering from the fires that came after. Layered on top of the multiplier effect was something crueler still, the domino effect. The late Bronze Age world was, as earlier chapters have shown, a genuinely interconnected network, a web of treaties, marriages and trade routes binding Egypt to the Hittites to Ugarit, Ugarit to Cyprus, Cyprus to the Aegean. Christopher Monroe has called this period exceptional in the treaties, laws, diplomacy and exchange that created the first great international era in world history. But a network built on mutual dependency carries a hidden cost. When one node in that network falls, the shock does not stay contained. Copper stops arriving from Cyprus. Tin stops arriving along the long overland road from Afghanistan. A kingdom that has spent generations perfecting bronze production and importing every raw material that process requires, finds itself suddenly unable to arm its soldiers or repair its tools. The fall of Ugarit was not merely the fall of one city on the Syrian coast. It was the severing of a link that other cities, other palaces, other economies had quietly come to depend upon.
Which leads to the darkest irony of the entire collapse. The very quality that had made this world so remarkable, its complexity, its reach, its extraordinary interconnectedness, was also what made it so fragile. Carol Bell has compared the strategic importance of Bronze Age tin to that of crude oil today, a single, vulnerable resource on which an entire technological civilization depended. The archaeologist Ken Dark describes this condition as hypercoherence, a state in which each part of the system becomes so dependent upon each other that change in any part produces instability in the system as a whole. One malfunctioning cog in an otherwise magnificent machine was enough to send the entire apparatus grinding to a halt. And so, no single factor bears the full weight of the story. As Nancy Sanders observed long ago, earthquakes, droughts, and famines are recurring features of life around the Mediterranean. Societies had weathered them before, rebuilt after them before, emerged from them stronger before. What made the years around 1177 BC different was not that any one hardship was unprecedented. It was that so many hardships arrived together, compounding one another, faster than any recovery could keep pace. It is tempting to view all this as a distant tragedy, safely sealed behind 3,000 years of dust. But the pattern is unsettlingly familiar. A 2020 survey of scientists across 52 countries warned of climate extremes, water scarcity, and food crises, amplifying the risks of each, creating a perfect storm that threatens to engulf humanity. A pandemic within weeks revealed how thoroughly global supply chains could seize up. A financial tremor on one continent in 2008 nearly cascaded into what one observer called a full-blown meltdown for the entire world economy. Drought in Syria has been linked cautiously to the unrest that followed. The Hittites had no power to end their drought. The question worth carrying forward is whether more advanced knowledge grants any greater power to withstand a storm of the same shape.
Chapter 10. A World Asleep. The storm passed. What it left behind was silence. Picture the land around Pylos, on the western coast of the Peloponnese, in the years after the palace burned. Before the fire, this had been the seat of a king who tracked, in a fine and complicated script, every jar of oil, every measure of grain, every bronzesmith working in his territory. Scribes bent over clay tablets in bright rooms, recording a world that ran on order. Then the flames came, so intense they baked those tablets hard and preserved them by accident. And after the flames came almost nothing at all. Archaeologists who have walked this ground in the centuries since describe a landscape that simply emptied out. Jack Davis of the University of Cincinnati has put it plainly. The destruction of the palace around 1180 BC was so complete that neither the palace nor the community around it ever recovered. The kingdom of Pylos, once a place of wealth and administration, remains severely depopulated for nearly 1,000 years. 1,000 years of quiet, where a kingdom used to be. This was the pattern of what followed the collapse, a period so marked by loss that scholars have long called it the world's first dark age. It did not end quickly. The new, diminished world that began around 1200 BC lasted, by conservative estimate, at least a century, and in some regions, 2 or 3. The Mediterranean of 1200 BC was already a different place by 1100 BC, and by 1000 BC, it had changed again, so thoroughly that little of the old order remained, even in memory of daily life. Communities did not simply stumble and rise again in a generation. It took decades, sometimes centuries, for people to rebuild anything resembling a functioning society, to climb back up out of the darkness they had fallen into. What had vanished, precisely? Everything that had made the Bronze Age world cohere. The centralized governments were gone. No more Wanax, no more supreme ruler issuing commands from a throne room. No more palace bureaucracy directing the labor of an entire region. Joseph Marin of the University of Heidelberg has noted the simple, stark fact of it. After the catastrophes, there were no palaces. Large-scale buildings stopped. The great halls with their frescoed walls and columned porticos
were not replaced. They were left as ruins, or scavenged, or simply avoided. And the long-distance trade that had once carried copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Egypt, and silver from the Greek mainland, across a network binding a dozen cultures together. That trade collapsed with the courts that had sustained it. The personal bonds between kings, the letters addressed to a royal brother, the treaties and marriages that had once smoothed the movement of goods and gold. All of it depended on the great palace states. When the palaces fell, the connection snapped, and foreign goods and foreign ideas simply stopped arriving. Along with the trade routes and the thrones, literacy itself disappeared across wide stretches of this world. The Mycenaeans had used a script called Linear B, an early form of Greek, to track the internal workings of their palace economies. How many sheep? How much wine? How many bronze workers owed labor to the crown? It was a script built for accounting, not literature, and it required trained scribes and a bureaucracy to sustain it. Once the palaces burned and the administrations they supported dissolved, there was no longer any institution left to need such record keeping. The script was not simplified or replaced. It was forgotten entirely and would remain undeciphered for 3,000 years, until a British architect named Michael Ventris cracked its code in 1952. In the Levant, the elaborate cuneiform writing of the Bronze Age courts likewise fell out of use, eventually giving way to newer, simpler systems, better suited to a smaller, humbler world.
If someone could have walked across this landscape in, say, 1100 BC, moving through the sites that had once glittered with Bronze Age wealth, the picture would have been one of quiet impoverishment. Where grand palaces had stood, with painted floors and storerooms stacked with oil jars, there were now scattered villages, smaller, poorer, and cut off from their neighbours. Populations had shrunk. Some communities had vanished outright. Others had gathered into modest clusters of houses, built from whatever materials lay at hand, sometimes literally among the ruins of what had come before. This was not one great empire crumbling into another, larger successor. It was fragmentation, an entire interconnected system breaking into dozens of small, self-sufficient, isolated pieces, each surviving as best it could. And yet, the memory of what had been lost did not vanish along with the palaces. It changed shape instead. The wealth, the kings, the warriors in bronze armor, the walls of Mycenae and the towers of Troy, these became the raw material of legend. Stirring monuments and dimly remembered tales were gradually reworked over generations into stories of a lost, heroic age. A golden and violent time when kings commanded armies and gods took sides in mortal wars. For centuries, no one wrote these stories down. They were carried instead by memory and voice,
passed from one generation of singers to the next, reshaped a little with each retelling, until, at last, in the 8th century BC, a poet remembered as Homer gathered them into the Iliad and the Odyssey. Even within those epics, scholars can still catch glimpses of a world older than the Trojan War the poems claim to describe. A tower shield carried by the hero Ajax, a style already obsolete for centuries. Swords studded with silver, a luxury no army could afford by the time of the war's traditional date. The tale of Heracles sacking Troy generations earlier with a mere 6 ships. Layers of memory folded one over another until fact and legend became impossible to fully separate. It was, in the end, all that remained of a shattered world. Not archives, not treaties, not tablets of careful accounts, but stories carried forward in the dark, waiting for someone to write them down.
Chapter 11. Seeds in the Dark. The stories at least survived. But stories are not history, only its after-image, glowing faintly on the inside of the eyelid, long after the light itself has gone out. And in the actual world, beyond the campfires where poets sang of Ajax and his tower shield, the darkness that followed the collapse was long and real and largely silent. For decades, then generations, then the better part of a century, the old order simply did not exist. No palace scribes counted grain. No great kings called each other brother. What remained were people, fewer of them, poorer, scattered, learning to live without the machinery that had once organized their world. And it was out of this quiet, out of this darkness, that something new began, slowly, to take root. Along the coast of Canaan, in cities that had burned only recently, new houses rose on the ash. At Ekron, archaeologists found the destruction there of the last Canaanite city lying directly beneath a settlement with different pottery, different hearths, different bathtubs, a different way of living entirely. At Ashkelon, the change came without evidence of violence at all. An Egyptian garrison town simply became something else. Its diet, its crafts, its loom weights, all shifting toward patterns familiar from the Aegean. These were the Philistines, and the Bible itself remembered them as coming from Crete. For over a century, the assumption was invasion. Ships landing, cities burning, a conquering people replacing the old inhabitants. The truth, as it usually does, turned out to be stranger and more human. Excavators now argue for a slower process, half a century or more, of migrants settling among Canaanites who never entirely left. At Ekron, a Canaanite village was destroyed and rebuilt as a Canaanite village again, before the newcomers ever arrived. Recent DNA, drawn from infants buried beneath Philistine houses at Ashkelon,
told the same quiet story. Bodies with southern European ancestry, likely tracing back to Bronze Age Crete, alongside genetic markers that were purely local. Evidence of intermarriage within a single generation. One archaeologist put it simply: real people moving from real troubles, finding new families in a new home. They brought new pigs, new crops, new pottery styles, and within a few generations, something neither fully Aegean nor fully Canaanite, but its own hybrid thing, standing on the coast where Egypt's empire used to reach. Inland, another people were emerging into the historical record for the first time. An Egyptian inscription carved for Pharaoh Meneptah, boasting of a campaign through Canaan around 1207 BC, lists among the conquered a people called Israel. Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. It is a strange kind of birth certificate, an enemy's boast preserving the earliest proof that a group by that name existed. By the 12th century BC, as Egyptian garrisons withdrew and Egyptian power receded from the region entirely, the Israelites appear as an identifiable presence in the highlands, one of several new peoples rising from the wreckage of Canaanite civilization alongside the Philistines on the coast.
Further north, along the shore of what is now Lebanon, another people seem almost to have slipped through the collapse unmarked. No burned cities, no destruction layer, no telltale ash. The region that would become Phoenicia shows little sign of the violence that consumed Ugarit and Hattusa. Whether through luck, adaptability, or simple distance from the collapsing centers of power, the Phoenicians endured, and in the centuries following would become sailors and traders without equal. Two things these new peoples shared, and both would outlast every one of them. The first was iron. Once imagined as a Hittite secret, a royal monopoly guarded behind palace walls, iron now spread freely, smelted wherever ore and fuel could be found, no king's permission required. It became, eventually, the metal that named the age itself. Cheaper than bronze, needing no long-distance tin from Afghanistan, no copper convoy from Cyprus. A farmer, a smith, a village on its own could make what a palace once had to import. The second was the alphabet. At Ugarit, before its final burning, scribes had already been experimenting with something radically simple. A script of only 2 or 3 dozen signs, sounds rather than whole words or syllables. Nothing like the hundreds of characters a cuneiform scribe spent years mastering. In the centuries after the collapse, it was the Phoenicians who carried this idea outward along their trade routes. A system so much easier to learn that it no longer belonged only to palace-trained specialists. Writing, once a tool of kings, became something nearly anyone could hold. Both changes point toward the same truth. The old world had been built on concentration, one palace controlling metal, grain, writing, trade, all threaded through a single throne. When the throne fell, everything tied to it fell with it. What replaced it was not a new empire, but something more scattered.
Small kingdoms, port cities, hill towns, each modest, each independent, each free of the fragility that comes with putting all the world's eggs in one royal basket. Greece, stripped of its palaces and its wanaks, its linear B forgotten within a generation, would not see a king like that again. In its place, eventually, smaller things would grow. A city-state here, an assembly there.
None of it happened quickly. For a long while there was only the quiet. Empty valleys where a palace once stood. A coastline of modest villages. A world waiting without knowing it was waiting. But seeds do not announce themselves in the dark. They simply lie there, past the reach of any king's memory, until the season turns and the light comes back, and something, at last, begins to grow.